While I was at chemo, my husband blew my insurance money on his mistress, called her his rock, and made her his power of attorney. Then she posted a pic holding my meds, so I looked him in the eyes and handed him an envelope labeled divorce papers. I was sitting in that same sterile hospital room, the one that smelled like rubbing alcohol and fake flowers, when I handed him the envelope. My hands were shaking, but not from the chemo this time. I was calm, cold, done. He looked at me with that smug, pitying face he'd been wearing for months. The one that said, "I'm such a good man for sticking around my sick wife." The envelope was thin, just a few sheets of paper, but it might as well have been a bomb, because it was. He smiled and said, "What's this, babe?" I smiled back. "Just something to make things easier for you." He laughed like I'd finally come to my senses. Like I was giving him permission to move on. Like he'd won. But he didn't know that I already knew. He didn't know that I'd seen the Instagram post, the one where his mistress, God, even that word feels too soft, was holding my anti-nausea meds like a trophy, captioning it, "He deserves a real woman." He didn't know I'd seen the restaurant receipts, the $1,200 dinners, the hotels, the spa weekends, all paid for with my insurance payout, the one that was supposed to cover my treatment when the cancer spread. And he didn't know that while he was making her his rock, making her his medical power of attorney, and telling the nurses I was emotionally unstable, I'd been quietly talking to my lawyer. I wanted to scream. I wanted to break every piece of hospital equipment in that room, but instead, I watched his face while he opened the envelope. The moment his eyes scanned the first line, the smile fell. He went pale. He looked at me, and for the first time in months, he didn't say a word. Because what he was holding wasn't a love letter or an apology or a goodbye. It was something much colder, much more final. And I could see the exact moment he realized that the game he'd been playing was over, and that I was no longer the sick, broken woman he thought he could replace. I just whispered, "You should read the last page." And then I stood up, IV still in my arm, and walked out. He didn't follow me. He couldn't. Because by the time he did read that last page, he'd realize I'd already taken something from him that no money, no mistress, and no lies could ever buy back. And I'll tell you exactly what was in that envelope, but to understand why I did it, you need to know how it all started. Back when I still thought he loved me, before the diagnosis, we were that couple everyone said was so in love it's disgusting. His name's Derek. We met in college. He was a business major who played guitar at open mics, and I was studying nursing. He'd bring me takeout during my night shifts, leave notes in my car, show up at my apartment with flowers for no reason. My friends used to joke that he'd ruin it for everyone else. We got married when I was 27. Small ceremony in Asheville, North Carolina. He cried when I walked down the aisle, big, ugly tears. I remember thinking, God, I am safe with this man. Then life started happening. He got a good job in sales. I worked at the hospital. We weren't rich, but we were doing okay. We had plans, kids someday, a house with a porch, trips we couldn't afford yet. Then, about a year and a half ago, I found a lump. Small, harmless looking, except it wasn't. It was stage 2 breast cancer. The day I told him, he went quiet. Not scared quiet, just blank, like he was already checking out. I tried to tell myself it was shock, that he'd come around. But when the treatment started, he was suddenly working late more often. He stopped coming to appointments. When I lost my hair, he wouldn't even look at me. Once, I asked if it bothered him that I didn't look the same. He said, "It's hard to watch someone you love stop being themselves." That sentence hit harder than the chemo ever did. Then came the money. My insurance payout was supposed to help with the bills, copays, wigs, extra meds. But he told me it made more sense for him to handle it since I was too emotional. I didn't argue. I was too tired. 3 months later, my card got declined at the pharmacy. I checked the account. $43.12 left. He said, "Don't worry, babe, I'll move some things around." That night, I couldn't sleep. Something told me to look. So I did. I logged into the shared account he forgot to unlink from my phone. Dinner at a steakhouse in Charlotte, $1,237. Hotel booking, $489. Jewelry store, $3,200. And then I saw it. A Venmo note from him to Tara read with the caption, "For putting up with my crazy week." Tara was his coworker. The one who texted him memes at midnight. The one he said was, "Just like a sister." Except sisters don't post mirror selfies from your husband's hotel bathroom. I remember sitting there, staring at that screen while my IV dripped beside me. I wasn't even crying. Just empty. I told myself maybe he was just confused, overwhelmed. Maybe he'd come back if I just fought harder, got better. But then, a week later, I walked into the hospital for chemo and heard a nurse say to another, "His girlfriend's been here every day, she's so sweet." Girlfriend. They meant his girlfriend, and when I asked who they were talking about, they said it. Tara, she's always here with Derek, she's his rock. My husband, my rock, sitting beside her. I thought the humiliation would kill me before the cancer did. But that's when something inside me hardened. I realized if I kept waiting for him to feel guilty, I'd die waiting. So I stopped crying, and I started planning. After that day at the hospital, something inside me flipped off. No more excuses, no more crying into my pillow while he was working late. I started documenting everything. I took screenshots of every transaction, every Venmo note, every email confirmation for a hotel room. I even started recording our conversations when he thought I was too weak to notice him scrolling through texts from her. He was careless, arrogant. He didn't even hide it anymore. He'd take calls from her in front of me. I remember lying in bed after chemo, nauseous and weak, while he laughed in the kitchen saying, "You're all I think about. She doesn't even notice I'm gone half the time." She, meaning me. The worst part wasn't the cheating, it was how he rewrote reality. To everyone else, I was the unstable wife who couldn't handle being sick. He started planting that seed everywhere with his friends, with my nurses, even my mom. He'd tell her, "She's been saying some crazy things, I think it's the meds." He was isolating me, turning me into the unreliable narrator of my own life. Then, the paperwork started showing up. I didn't even know he'd filed for medical power of attorney, making Tara the one who could make decisions, if I wasn't capable. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He actually said, "You'd want someone I trust to take care of things, right?" I stared at him, too shocked to speak. And he added, "You're not yourself lately, you should focus on healing. Let me handle the adult stuff." That's when I realized it wasn't just betrayal, it was control. He wanted me powerless, sick, and silent while he lived a new life using my money and name. Then came the post. It was a Tuesday night. I was scrolling through Instagram when her face popped up. Tara. She was in his kitchen, wearing one of my old sweaters, holding my medication in her hand. Caption. "He deserves a real woman." That's when my body went cold. Not angry, not even sad, just cold. Because I knew something neither of them seemed smart enough to realize. When you're the one with cancer, the hospital keeps records. Signatures, authorization forms, insurance transactions. And every one of those things had his name on them. If I died, he'd cash out a 6-figure payout. If I lived, he'd still keep the rest because I'd trusted him to manage my finances. He wasn't waiting for me to get better. He was waiting for me to disappear. So I went quiet. I played the role, weak, tired, compliant. I let him believe he'd won. But I started visiting a different kind of office. Not the oncology wing this time, but my lawyer's. I sat there in my scarf and IV port and said, "I need to make some changes to my estate." And by the time I was done, everything, every cent, every right, every choice was moved out of his reach. He thought I was dying. But what I was really doing was setting the stage. Because if he wanted a life without me, I was going to give it to him, exactly the way he deserved it. The day everything snapped, it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. I had just come home from a brutal chemo session, the kind that makes your bones feel like they're burning from the inside. I walked in the door and heard voices, laughter, glasses clinking. He'd brought her there, to our house. Tara's laugh was high and fake, the kind that always made my skin crawl. She was sitting on my couch, the one he and I picked out together, her legs tucked under her, a glass of wine in hand. My husband was standing in the kitchen, cutting into a steak. For her, the same man who told me he couldn't afford groceries that week because of my medical bills. He looked up and froze when he saw me. "Babe," he started. "Don't," I said, voice shaking. "Don't you dare call me that." Tara had the nerve to smirk. "You should have texted before coming home, we were just—" "I live here," I said, my throat dry. "You're the guest." She rolled her eyes and whispered, "Barely." I could have hit her. I didn't. I just looked at him, waiting for him to say something, anything. But he didn't. He just looked guilty, then angry, then bored. Finally, he sighed and said, "You're making this harder than it needs to be. You're sick, and you don't want to admit it's over." That's when I realized the truth. He didn't feel guilty because he'd already moved on. Emotionally, financially, legally. I was just a technicality he hadn't gotten rid of yet. A week later, my oncologist called me, but not about my scans, about a form. Apparently, my husband had called to ask about DNR options and long-term care facilities. He wanted to sign me off. I couldn't breathe. I sat there listening to the nurse explain, thinking maybe she misunderstood. But then she read the note on file. In the event patient becomes incapacitated, decisions should be deferred to medical power of attorney, Tara Wilkes. That was her full name. In my medical record, he had officially replaced me. I called him shaking. He didn't even deny it. He just said, "You're being dramatic. I was trying to plan for the future." I said, "My future doesn't involve her." And he said, "I swear on my life, if you loved me, you'd let me be happy." That was the moment something in me broke clean. Not cracked, broke, because I realized this wasn't about love. It was about him finding a way to profit off my suffering while pretending to be the grieving husband. So I let him think he'd won. I let Tara post her stupid photos. I let him play the doting partner at the hospital while she waited in his car. And I finished my treatments quietly. But what neither of them knew was that every time they visited me, every text, every transaction, every recorded conversation, I was saving it all. And my lawyer was, too. Because the final thing Derek signed for me, the one he thought was giving him my estate, was actually transferring everything to someone else. And he didn't notice because he never read a single word I asked him to sign. He just smiled and said, "Of course, babe, anything for you." And he signed away his life. After that, I stopped reacting, stopped arguing, stopped begging him to see what he'd done. I just disappeared into silence. It drove him crazy. He'd come into my hospital room pretending to care, flowers, fake sympathy, the concerned husband, routine, and I'd smile and thank him like I actually believed it. Meanwhile, every time he touched a paper, I made sure it was one that mattered. The update forms, the consent pages, the final wishes packet, every signature he gave me was another nail in his own coffin. See, the thing about being sick is people underestimate you. They assume your weakness means you're not paying attention. But I was watching everything. Every time Tara posted something with him, I took screenshots. When she bragged about spoiling her man with his money, I quietly noted the dates. When she posted a story of them on vacation, the one he said was a work trip, I saved the metadata. My lawyer helped me build a file, a very organized, time-stamped, legally airtight file. Fraud, financial abuse, medical manipulation, emotional cruelty. He thought he was cashing in on my illness. What he didn't know was that every check, every signature, every business expense he'd written off under my name was being funneled into a case strong enough to destroy him. I also started moving money. Slowly, carefully. Just a few hundred at a time, enough to go unnoticed. But by the end of 6 months, the joint account was basically drained. All tucked away into a separate trust, one that didn't have his name on it anywhere. And the trust. It had one beneficiary, me. But my favorite part, the part that kept me warm at night when my bones ached and my hair fell out, was the power of attorney. He thought Tara had it. She didn't. Because a little clause on one of the routine forms he'd signed at the hospital nullified any other authorization except the one filed under my name. Meaning, if something happened to me, I decided what happened next, not them. And then there was the insurance, the big one, the life payout. He thought he was listed as beneficiary. He was until I changed it to someone else, someone he never would have seen coming. My sister, for one. And another portion to a fund for cancer patients who couldn't afford wigs or treatment. The very thing I once couldn't pay for because he was busy buying another woman jewelry. When it was all ready, I called my lawyer and said, "I want the papers done by Friday." He asked, "Are you sure you're ready for this?" I said, "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." So when Derek showed up at the hospital that next Monday, all charm and pity and fake devotion, I knew exactly what I was doing. That was the day I gave him the envelope. And inside, underneath the divorce papers, underneath the power of attorney revocation, underneath the insurance beneficiary transfer confirmation, was one last page. A simple letter, written in my handwriting, that said, "You taught me how cruel love can be. Now you'll learn how expensive it is." But what came after that What I found out only days later was something I never saw coming. Something that made me realize I hadn't just been dealing with a cheating husband. I'd been living beside a monster. 3 days after I handed Derek the envelope, my lawyer called me at 9 a.m. sharp. His voice was tight, almost nervous. "Something's come up," he said. "You need to see this." I thought maybe Derek had contested the divorce already, or maybe he'd tried to freeze the accounts. But what I found out when I got there made my stomach turn. The insurance company had flagged something, a duplicate policy. Apparently, 6 months earlier, a joint life insurance policy had been opened under both our names. Except this one listed Tara as the secondary beneficiary, not me. The documents showed my forged signature, my fake initials, even a fake email account made to look like mine. And who had filed it? Derek. He'd created a fraudulent policy that would pay both him and Tara if I died. And the kicker? The policy was double the amount of the legitimate one, meaning if my treatment failed, he wouldn't just be a grieving widower, he'd be a millionaire. I sat there in my lawyer's office, numb, while he scrolled through the paperwork. It wasn't sloppy. It was planned, precise, months of deceit. I'd thought I was getting revenge on a cheater. But I was staring at evidence that my husband might have been waiting for me to die, or worse, helping the odds along. Because the more we looked, the worse it got. My prescriptions had been refilled inconsistently. One of the medications, my nausea control pills, had been replaced with generic capsules that didn't match my dosage. There were requests for experimental trials signed in my name that I'd never agreed to. I started connecting dots I didn't want to see. Those weird dizzy spells. The times I'd been nauseous before chemo. The few days where my pill bottles didn't look quite right. He'd been tampering with them. When I confronted my oncologist, she looked horrified. She pulled my records. Half my medication logs were handwritten by Derek. The nurse who'd called him her rock. She remembered him helping with my meds, bringing them from home. My skin went cold. I felt it, the terror, the disbelief, the rage all twisting together. That man had been standing over me, watching me choke down pills he'd switched, smiling and saying, "You've got to fight, babe." He wasn't trying to help me fight. He was trying to finish me off. I called the police that night. They started an investigation, quiet but serious. Forgery, insurance fraud, medical interference. It was a list long enough to bury him. But I didn't tell him I knew. Not yet. I kept acting like everything was normal. Because if he wanted to play patient and caretaker, I'd let him. Only this time, I was the one watching him. And while the detectives built their case, I started working on something much more personal. Because exposing him in court would ruin his freedom. But I wanted to ruin something deeper. His name, his pride, his perfect little image of himself as the devoted husband. So I planned one final performance. One that would make sure everyone, his family, his job, his mistress, saw him for what he really was. And when it was done, I'd finally tell him the truth, that I'd known about his plan to cash out my death for months, and that the only one losing everything was him. When everything finally came to light, it was almost too simple, too disgustingly logical to believe. The cops interviewed him first. He didn't even try to deny the policy. He acted offended. He said it was a smart move, a backup plan, in case the worst happened. He called it financial security for the people I love. But that's not why he did it. The detectives pieced it together from texts between him and Tara. She'd saved everything on her phone, probably thinking it made her look like a victim. But those messages showed exactly what he really was, not a grieving husband, not a man falling out of love. A calculating predator, he wrote. If she doesn't make it through, it'll finally be over. And the payout could cover everything. You and me, clean start, debt-free. He wasn't even hiding it anymore. He was talking about my death like a business deal. Another message, 2 months before I discovered the affair, chilled me to the bone. She's too proud to quit treatment. Sometimes you've got to let nature take its course. You know what I mean? That was when Tara replied, "You can't rush fate, baby, we'll get our time." They were waiting me out, counting down. But the deeper I looked, the clearer it got. It wasn't just about money. It was about power. See, Derek wasn't always like this. When I met him, he was charming, but beneath that was a streak, a need to be admired. He lived for validation. Every compliment, every "you're so good to her," fed him like oxygen. When I got sick, the attention shifted. Suddenly, I was the one people felt sorry for. I was the strong one. He became the caretaker, and he hated it. He told a friend, it was in one of the transcripts, "I can't stand how everyone looks at me like I'm some saint for staying. I didn't sign up for this. I want my life back." That's the moment he started looking for someone who would make him feel powerful again. Enter Tara. She wasn't just a mistress. She was a mirror. She told him he was a hero, that he deserved to be happy, that I was holding him hostage in a tragedy. And he believed it. When I stopped being the version of me that worshipped him, he needed someone who would. And when I couldn't die fast enough to free him, he decided to help fate along. He'd built this twisted narrative where he was the victim, not me, where my death was just the closing chapter of his sad story. And when I realized that, the anger disappeared. It was replaced by something colder, clarity, because now I understood exactly what I was dealing with. Not a husband who made a mistake, a man who thought he could control how I lived, how I died, and how I'd be remembered. But he didn't know that the woman he thought was too weak to fight back was already rewriting the ending. I wasn't going to let him bury me. I was going to make him watch everything he built fall apart piece by piece, while the whole world saw what he really was. And I had the perfect way to do it. When it was over, it didn't feel like victory so much as a careful, quiet unmaking of his life. I didn't explode. I didn't scream. I assembled facts like an autopsy. Timestamps, receipts, recorded conversations, hospital logs, the forged insurance policy. Every paper he thought he had hidden behind a husband's smile had my name on it. Only this time it was inked by me, legally. I started where it would hurt him most, his image. I handed everything to the detective assigned to the case. We met at a coffee shop because he didn't want my name in the precinct files yet. He read. He asked if I was sure. I told him I was. He put a folder with copies back into my hands and said, "We'll start with the hospital and the insurance company. We'll take it from there." Then I called the hospital administrator and asked for a meeting. I brought the nurse who remembered him, helping with my meds, and the records that showed his handwriting in my charts. I watched faces change color as they realized how much had been manipulated under their roof. Protocols had been ignored, staff had been lied to. The administrator promised a full internal review. Next was the insurance investigator. He opened my file and didn't even look up before he said, "This is organized." I gave him the forged policy, the emails sent from the fake account, the metadata from Tara's posts that showed dates and locations matching his credit card charges. He told me quietly that companies don't take kindly to fraud that looks like murder for profit. Then I did the thing that felt like medicine. I took control of the narrative. I posted the truth to the one place he'd built his reputation, social circles, coworkers, the church group that loved their devoted husband. Not a sensational post. A careful timeline with copies of documents and screenshots, redacted where it needed to be. I included contact info for the detective and the hospital administrator for anyone who had been contacted by him. Within 48 hours, his phone started ringing. The calls were from friends asking questions, from his supervisor demanding explanations, from Tara, who sent a single string of texts that made my stomach turn. "This is a mistake. I didn't know." The detective called me 2 days later and said there was probable cause for arrest on multiple counts: insurance fraud, forgery, and tampering with medication. The hospital placed him on unpaid leave pending their review. His mistress, his rock, suddenly cultivated plausible deniability faster than she ever chose loyalty. When the sheriff knocked on his door, he wore the same look he'd given me when I handed him the envelope, disbelief. They read him his rights. He asked for a lawyer. He tried to bargain. The transcript from his interrogation, the one the detective sent me a week later, reads like the confession he didn't know he was making. Arithmetic of greed, callous words about starting over, admissions about switching pills and altering charts. I felt nothing when I read it. Relief, maybe. Closure, finally. My sister flew in to sit with me the night he was booked. I cried then, not from the chemo, but from the exhaustion of keeping light under me for so long. We used some of the reallocated funds to secure better care, to get the wig I'd wanted, to set up the small fund in my name for women who couldn't afford treatment extras. I watched the hospital post updated protocols publicly. The insurance company launched their internal fraud unit. Derek's name disappeared from newsletters and boards and brunch invites. He lost more than money. He lost his job, his freedoms, and the performative sainthood he'd been addicted to. The worst part for him, and I won't pretend I didn't savor it, was watching people I cared about read the documents and turn away from him. There's a sting worse than prison, being exposed to people you wanted to impress. I'm not healed. The scar tissue is there physically and in the corners of my mind. But I sleep differently now. There's no pretending. There's no waiting for apologies. I planted the charity's first check this spring. We gave wigs to 3 women in my chemo group. Sometimes I see a photo of one of them wearing a new headscarf, and I think about how small kindnesses matter more than any man's charm. And Derek, he keeps calling from jail, sometimes pleading, sometimes bitter. I screen his calls. The last voicemail he left was shorter than his crimes. If you loved me, you'd let me be happy. I saved it. Then I deleted it. I closed the envelope the same way I opened it, with hands that had been weak and became steady. He spent my payout on her. Now he's spending his time paying for a lawyer he can't charm. Some debts don't get paid back in cash. They get paid back in truth, and that turned out to be priceless.